You handled it fine, and you haven't stopped thinking about it since. That's the part nobody talks about. Not the breaking, the almost breaking. The meeting where you stayed calm but your hands were doing something weird under the table. The phone call you got through, said the right things, hung up, and then sat in your car for 11 minutes, not quite ready to go back inside. The week where everything was technically fine, and you were exhausted in a way that sleep didn't touch. You didn't break. You also didn't feel unbreakable. You felt like someone who got lucky with the difficulty level. And somewhere underneath the functioning, underneath the competence and the getting through it, there's a question you don't ask out loud. What happens when it gets harder than this? It will get harder than this. That's not pessimism. That's the structure of a life that's actually being lived. Careers escalate. Relationships deepen and complicate. Parents age. Markets shift. The difficulty doesn't plateau once you've proven you can handle the current level. It finds the next level. And most people meet each new level with the same equipment they had at the last one, which works until it doesn't. And then they're genuinely surprised, which is the most expensive kind of surprise there is. I spent a long time thinking I was handling stress well, because I wasn't visibly falling apart. That's a low bar dressed as a standard. What I was actually doing was managing, which is different from being capable. Managing means the pressure is slightly below the breaking point. Capable means the breaking point keeps moving. Here's what I eventually understood, later than I should have. Stress doesn't reveal character. It reveals preparation. The person who stays clear-headed when everything is falling apart isn't a different kind of human. They built something the other person didn't. Not in the crisis, before it. In the ordinary, unremarkable periods when building was possible and nothing was forcing them to. You are almost certainly in one of those periods right now. This book is about using it, not to become someone who feels nothing. That's not resilience, that's a different problem. But to become someone for whom difficulty is no longer an emergency. Someone whose threshold keeps expanding. Someone who, when the next hard thing arrives, has something to meet it with. The goal isn't a stress-free life. It's a self that pressure can't define. That's built here, in the quiet, before the storm needs you. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1, The Fragility Myth. Somewhere along the way, avoiding hard things started getting called wisdom. Not laziness, not fear, wisdom, self-awareness, knowing your limits. There's an entire vocabulary that developed, quietly, collectively, for retreating from discomfort while feeling sophisticated about it. And if you've spent any time in the last decade near wellness culture, productivity culture, or really any culture with a podcast, you've absorbed some of it. We all have. The problem isn't self-awareness. The problem is that we started using the language of self-knowledge to justify self-protection. And those are not the same thing. Here's the actual psychology. Human beings are extraordinarily good at confusing what is familiar with what is safe. If you've spent years avoiding conflict, conflict feels dangerous. Not because it is, but because avoidance has trained your nervous system to treat it that way. If you've never sat with financial uncertainty, a single unexpected bill can feel like catastrophe. The discomfort is real. The danger usually is not. But your nervous system doesn't make that distinction. It just reports what it knows. And what it knows is what you've repeatedly shown it. This is the fragility loop. You avoid something uncomfortable. The avoidance feels like relief. Relief reinforces the avoidance. The thing you avoided grows slightly more threatening in your mind because you never found out it was survivable. Repeat for 20 years, and you have a person who is genuinely, measurably less capable of handling difficulty than they were as a child. Not because life broke them, because comfort slowly, consistently narrowed what they could tolerate. Fragility isn't a personality type, it's a training outcome, which means it can be retrained. That's the hopeful part. The slightly uncomfortable part is that retraining requires doing the thing the fragility loop has been steering you away from, which is voluntary exposure to the things that feel hard. Not recklessly, not dramatically. Just consistently enough that your nervous system updates its threat assessment. A man I knew ran a small business for 11 years. Sharp guy, good instincts. Every time a difficult conversation needed to happen, with a partner, a vendor, an employee who was underperforming, he found a reason to delay it. He was strategic about the delay. He'd frame it as timing, as tact, as not wanting to act on emotion. The conversations kept not happening. The problems those conversations would have resolved kept compounding. When the business finally hit a wall that required him to have 6 hard conversations simultaneously, he couldn't do it. Not because he'd become less intelligent, because he'd spent 11 years training himself out of the capacity. The fragility myth, and it is a myth, is that some people are just built for pressure, and some aren't. That stress tolerance is a trait, like eye color, distributed unevenly at birth and more or less fixed. This belief is extraordinarily convenient for people who would prefer not to train. It is also completely unsupported by what we know about neuroplasticity, behavioral conditioning, and the psychology of skill development. What's actually true is simpler and less flattering. People who handle pressure well have usually handled a lot of pressure. Not because they sought suffering, because they didn't arrange their lives to avoid it. They stayed in difficult situations long enough to discover the difficulty was survivable. Their nervous systems learned, their confidence updated. Not through inspiration, through repetition. Stress reveals character, yes. But character isn't fixed. Character is the accumulated result of choices made under pressure over time. Which means every time you face something hard and stay present for it, you are literally building a different person than the one who would have looked away. I avoided a particular type of professional confrontation for about 3 years early in my career. I told myself I was picking battles. I was picking comfort. The battles I didn't pick picked me, eventually, in worse forms, at worse times. The entry point isn't dramatic. You don't need to manufacture a crisis. You just need to stop treating the small discomforts as optional. The difficult email you keep not sending. The conversation that needs to happen. The commitment you quietly abandoned because no one was watching. These aren't small things. They are practice. And right now, they are either building your capacity or eroding it. There is no neutral position. The fragility myth gives you permission to wait until you feel ready. The truth is, readiness is built from doing the thing before you feel ready. That's not a motivational slogan. That's operant conditioning. Your nervous system cannot learn that something is survivable until you survive it. You've been calling it caution. Some of it is caution. The rest of it is practice for breaking. Chapter 2. Building when it's quiet. You don't install a smoke detector while your kitchen is on fire. This seems obvious. It is obvious. And yet the overwhelming majority of people approach stress preparation with exactly that logic. They wait until the pressure is already on. until the anxiety is already loud, until the situation is already deteriorating. And then they try to build the capacity that should have been built months ago in a Tuesday afternoon with nothing urgent happening. The Tuesday afternoon, of course, was spent on other things. This is not a character flaw. It's a feature of human cognition called present bias. The deeply wired tendency to weight immediate comfort over future capability. Your brain is not trying to sabotage you. It's doing exactly what brains evolved to do, which is conserve energy when there's no immediate threat. The problem is that the threats you need to prepare for are rarely immediate. They're coming. They're just not here yet. And the brain, left to its own preferences, will not prepare for something it cannot currently see. So preparation requires override. It requires a decision, made consciously and repeatedly, to build during the calm. Not because it feels urgent, but because you understand that the calm is exactly when building is possible. Think about what you actually have access to when life is quiet. You have cognitive bandwidth. You can think clearly, plan carefully, identify gaps without the distortion of active stress. You have time. Not the frantic, compressed time of a crisis, but actual time. To practice. To experiment. To fail at small things without serious consequence. You have emotional resources, the patience to build habits, the steadiness to maintain routines, the perspective to see your own patterns without defensiveness. All of that disappears under pressure. Every single resource that makes preparation effective evaporates precisely when you most need the results of preparation. This is why waiting is so expensive. You're not just delaying the work. You're guaranteeing you'll have to do harder work with worse tools under worse conditions. There's a specific kind of person who becomes extraordinary under pressure. From the outside, they look like naturals, calm when others aren't, clear when others are confused, decisive when others freeze. People assume they were built that way. They weren't. What they built, quietly, in the unremarkable periods between crises, was infrastructure. Physical health maintained consistently enough to provide reserves when reserves were needed. Sleep protected like a professional obligation, not abandoned when things got busy. A morning routine that wasn't about productivity. It was about arriving at difficulty from a position of order rather than chaos. Financial buffers that meant an unexpected expense was an inconvenience, not an emergency. None of that is glamorous. None of it trends. You don't post about maintaining a consistent bedtime. But the person who has done those things for 2 years walks into a crisis with resources. The person who hasn't walks in already depleted. Your environment is part of the infrastructure, and most people completely ignore it. A cluttered, disorganized space creates low-level cognitive load continuously. You don't notice it the way you notice a loud noise. It just quietly taxes your mental resources every hour you're in it. When stress arrives and your cognitive resources are already running thin, that tax becomes significant. Clean your space, not because tidiness is virtuous, but because your environment is either spending your mental energy or returning it. That's not aesthetics. That's engineering. The people you spend time with are infrastructure too. I watched a colleague, genuinely talented, actually capable under pressure, spend 3 years surrounded by people who treated every minor setback as catastrophe. Not malicious people. Just people for whom dramatic emotional response to difficulty was the normal register. He absorbed it. Slowly, without noticing, his own threshold for what constituted a crisis dropped to match theirs. By the time real pressure arrived, he was already exhausted from years of treating ordinary friction like emergency. Calm is contagious in the same direction panic is. Choose accordingly. The financial piece gets avoided in conversations about stress resilience because it feels crass, like reducing something psychological to something mercenary. But financial instability is one of the most reliable sources of the kind of chronic, grinding stress that degrades every other capacity you have. It's not that money buys happiness. It's that financial precarity occupies cognitive bandwidth permanently. When a portion of your brain is always running threat calculations about money, there's less brain available for everything else. An emergency fund is not a financial product. It's a cognitive resource. What you consume mentally is infrastructure. The steady diet of news designed to maintain outrage, social media optimized for anxiety, content that keeps you in a state of low-level agitation. This is not neutral input. It is active training. It is teaching your nervous system that the baseline state is threat. And a nervous system trained to expect threat finds threat everywhere, including in situations that don't contain it. Building when it's quiet doesn't require a dramatic overhaul. It requires a shift in how you think about the unremarkable days. The days when nothing urgent is happening are not rest days from the project of becoming resilient. They are the project. The crisis will show up and use whatever you built during the ordinary days. Or it will show up and find nothing there. The smoke detector doesn't care that you meant to install it. You're still here. 2 chapters in, that's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. Chapter 3, The Body Votes First. Your hands started shaking before you even knew you were scared. That's not a metaphor. That's the actual sequence. The threat signal travels through your nervous system and reaches your body before it reaches your conscious awareness. Your heart rate climbs. Your breathing changes. Your muscles load with tension. And somewhere slightly after all of that, your brain generates the thought, something is wrong. You experience this as fear arriving. What actually happened is that fear already arrived. You just got the notification late. Most people spend their entire lives in an adversarial relationship with this process. They feel the physical symptoms of stress and interpret them as malfunction. The racing heart means something is wrong with them. The shaking hands are embarrassing. The tight chest is a sign they can't handle this. So they fight the symptoms. They try to suppress them, hide them, will them away. And in fighting the symptoms, they amplify the signal, because a nervous system that is being resisted becomes louder, not quieter. Here's the reframe that actually works, and it's not positive thinking. Your stress response is not attacking you. It is, in the most literal biological sense, trying to help you. The increased heart rate is delivering more oxygenated blood to your muscles and brain. The heightened alertness is sharpening your perceptual focus. The tension is preparing your body for action. This is an extraordinarily sophisticated emergency system that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. It is very good at its job. The problem is not the system. The problem is that you never learned to work with it. Your breath is the only part of your autonomic nervous system you can consciously control. Everything else, heart rate, digestion, immune response, runs on its own. But breath sits at the intersection of voluntary and involuntary, which means it's a lever, a direct line into the machinery that's running your stress response. And almost nobody uses it deliberately until they're already drowning, at which point they've waited too long, and the technique doesn't work because they've never practiced it. The 4-count in, hold, 6-count out pattern isn't relaxation. It's a neurological intervention. The extended exhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the branch responsible for calm, clear cognition. Done consistently, it sends the brain a signal that the threat has passed, and it is safe to downregulate. Done occasionally, in moments of panic, by someone who has never practiced it, it mostly just gives you something to do while you're panicking. The difference between those two outcomes is practice. Boring, undramatic, Tuesday afternoon practice. Posture gets dismissed because it sounds like advice from a 1950s etiquette manual. Stand up straight. Pull your shoulders back. It sounds cosmetic. It isn't. Your physical position sends continuous proprioceptive feedback to your brain about your status and safety. Contracted, hunched, shoulders forward. Your brain receives this as a threat posture. It responds accordingly. Open posture, weight distributed, spine extended. The brain receives this as a signal of control. Amy Cuddy's research got overcomplicated in the press, but the core finding is real. Your body is not just expressing your psychological state, it is informing it. Change the position, change the signal, change the state. I was in a meeting once where the conversation turned hostile faster than I expected. I noticed my shoulders had come up around my ears before I'd registered the shift in tone. My body knew before I did. I didn't have the presence of mind to do anything useful about it. Movement metabolizes stress hormones in a way that nothing else does. Cortisol and adrenaline are designed to fuel physical action. Running, fighting, lifting, moving. In modern stress situations, that physical action almost never happens. You sit in a meeting while your body is chemically prepared to sprint. You have a difficult phone call while flooded with hormones calibrated for physical exertion. The hormones don't disappear because the physical action didn't happen. They stay in your system, keeping your threat response elevated, making the next thing feel more stressful than it is, and the thing after that. A 10-minute walk after a high-stress event is not a lifestyle suggestion. It's chemistry. Temperature is an underused tool. Cold exposure, cold showers, cold water on the face, triggers a controlled, sympathetic nervous system response. Your body encounters a stressor and must regulate itself back to equilibrium. Done repeatedly, this trains your nervous system to handle the spike and recovery cycle more efficiently. You are literally practicing stress regulation at the physiological level. The cold doesn't feel good. That's the point. The discomfort is the training. Sleep deprivation is the quiet multiplier that makes everything worse. When you are underslept, your amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, becomes hyperreactive. Studies show up to 60% greater emotional reactivity in sleep-deprived subjects. 60%. You are not the same person on poor sleep. You are a measurably more reactive, less regulated, cognitively compromised version of that person. And that version is the one showing up to your stressful situations if you haven't protected your sleep. This isn't about feeling rested. It's about arriving at difficulty with a brain that functions. What you eat affects your stress response in ways that feel indirect until they don't. Blood sugar instability creates a physiological stress state that your brain cannot distinguish from external threat. You eat poorly, your blood sugar spikes and crashes. Your body reads this as an emergency. Your stress response activates, and now you're bringing a pre-activated stress response into whatever actually stressful situation you encounter next. The compounding is invisible until it isn't. Your face is connected to your nervous system in a direction most people don't expect. The expression you hold doesn't just reflect your internal state, it influences it. Jaw clenching, furrowed brow, tightened lips. These feed back into the system and maintain the stress signal. Consciously releasing your face, softening the jaw, smoothing the forehead. These sound absurd until you try them during a hard moment and notice the shift. The absurdity is part of why people don't use it. The effectiveness is why they should. The body is not the obstacle between you and handling stress well. It's the instrument. Most people spend their lives playing it with their elbows. Chapter 4. The Gap. The most powerful place in human psychology has no square footage. It exists in time, not space. A fraction of a second, maybe less. The interval between what happens to you and what you do about it. Stimulus, then response. And in between, if you know to look for it, a gap. A pause so small most people pass through it without noticing, without choosing, without realizing they had a choice at all. Viktor Frankl wrote about this from inside a Nazi concentration camp. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was describing the specific psychological mechanism that kept certain people intact under conditions designed to destroy them. The gap wasn't comfortable. It wasn't easy to find, but it was there. And the people who found it, who learned to inhabit that fraction of a second, retained something the conditions could not take. Most people live their entire lives without visiting that space, not because they're weak, because they're fast. Reactive speed feels like competence. You get triggered, you respond immediately. The situation moves forward. There's a momentum to reactivity that feels like control. It isn't. It's the opposite of control. It's your nervous system running a program that was written years ago, in different circumstances, for different problems, and running it automatically without your input, because you never inserted yourself into the sequence. The gap is where self-authorship lives. Everything outside the gap, the trigger, the situation, the pressure, the other people, you don't control any of that. But in the gap, briefly, you are in charge, not of what happens, of who you are in response to what happens. That distinction sounds philosophical until you're in a situation where it's the only thing that matters. Here's what's actually happening neurologically when you react without pausing. The amygdala, your brain's threat detection system, processes incoming stimuli faster than the prefrontal cortex, which handles reasoning, judgment, and impulse control. When a trigger arrives, the amygdala fires first. If the trigger is significant enough, it can effectively hijack the prefrontal cortex, flooding the system with stress hormones before your reasoning brain has fully come online. This is what people mean when they describe saying something they immediately regretted. The amygdala spoke. The prefrontal cortex arrived late to the conversation and had to clean up. The pause interrupts that sequence. Even 2 seconds is enough to begin engaging the prefrontal cortex. 5 seconds, and you've shifted the balance significantly. 10 seconds, and you're operating from a genuinely different neurological state than the one that wanted to react. The pause isn't passivity. It's neurological judo. A woman I worked with was extraordinarily competent, technically sharp, genuinely respected. But she had one pattern that kept costing her. When challenged in meetings, she'd respond immediately and defensively, with a precision that was impressive and a tone that closed conversations rather than opened them. She was always right. She was often alone. The content of her responses wasn't the problem. The 0-second gap between trigger and response was the problem. She never gave herself time to choose which version of right she wanted to be. Training the pause starts small, not in boardrooms, not in crises, in traffic. Someone cuts you off. Notice the spike. Don't suppress it. Notice it. Take one breath before you react. That's the whole exercise. You're not trying to feel zen. You're trying to insert a beat of consciousness into a sequence that usually runs without you. Do that consistently in low-stakes situations, and something interesting happens. The gap starts to appear in higher-stakes situations too. Not because you forced it there, because you trained it there. Questions are the most effective gap extenders available. When a trigger lands and you feel the pull toward immediate response, a question buys time while also doing something useful. What's actually happening here? What do I actually want from this? What would the clearest version of me do right now? These aren't rhetorical. They force the brain to shift from the reactive mode, which is pattern matching, fast, and often wrong, to the deliberative mode, which is slower, more accurate, and more aligned with what you actually value. The pause is especially critical in conversations, because conversations are where most people do their most expensive reacting. Someone says something that lands wrong. The immediate response is defensive or aggressive or withdrawing, and whichever it is, it usually makes the conversation worse. A pause before responding, even just a breath, even just the moment of actually hearing what was said, rather than reacting to the emotional valence of it, changes the entire trajectory. Not because the pause is magic, because the pause lets you respond to what was actually said instead of what your nervous system decided it meant. There's a version of the pause that gets misused. The performative pause. The slow, theatrical breath taken to signal composure rather than to achieve it. This is the pause as costume. It doesn't work because it's not doing the neurological work. It's just adding a beat of theater to a reaction that was already loaded. The real pause is internal. It's the moment of genuinely not knowing yet what you're going to say. The discomfort of that not knowing is exactly what makes it effective. Mastering the gap doesn't make you slow. It makes you precise. The people who seem unnervingly calm under pressure aren't taking longer to respond. They're responding from a different place, from choice rather than reflex. That quality reads as confidence because it is confidence, not the performed kind, the kind that comes from knowing you're the one deciding. Most people are not deciding. They are being decided by their history, their habits, their nervous system's best guess about what this situation probably requires based on the last time something felt like this. The gap is where you fire the nervous system's best guess and make your own. Chapter 5. The meaning you assign. Two people walk into the same terrible Monday. Only one of them leaves intact. Same traffic. Same difficult email waiting in the inbox. Same meeting that runs long and resolves nothing. Same stack of problems that didn't exist on Friday. From the outside, the situations are identical. From the inside, they are happening in completely different universes. One person's nervous system is registering threat, damage, evidence that things are bad and getting worse. The other person's nervous system is registering activation, challenge, information about what needs attention. Same Monday. Completely different physiological and psychological experience of that Monday. The difference isn't temperament. It isn't that one person has easier problems. It isn't that one person doesn't care. It's that they have assigned different meanings to the same set of signals, and their bodies, their thinking, and their performance are all responding to the meaning, not the signals. This is the part of stress psychology that gets dismissed as positive thinking, which is unfortunate because it has nothing to do with positive thinking. Positive thinking says, tell yourself things are fine when they aren't. What we're talking about is something more precise and more honest than that. It's accurate thinking about what your stress response is actually doing, what the pressure actually means, and what the most useful interpretation of the situation actually is. The goal isn't to feel better. The goal is to think more clearly and perform more effectively. Those happen to produce better outcomes, which eventually produces better feelings. But that's a side effect, not the mechanism. Your body does not have separate systems for stress and excitement. The physiological signatures are nearly identical: increased heart rate, faster breathing, heightened sensory alertness, muscle activation. Cortisol and adrenaline both present. The body is doing the same thing. What differs is the cognitive label applied to the experience. When the label is threat, the body tightens, cognition narrows, performance typically degrades. When the label is challenge or activation, the body mobilizes, cognition stays broader, performance often improves. The sensations are the same. The meaning is different. The outcomes diverge significantly. Researchers at Harvard found that people who were told to reframe anxiety as excitement before a stressful performance task, a speech, a math test, a negotiation, performed measurably better than those who tried to calm down. Not because excitement is better than calm, but because telling yourself to calm down when your body is activated is fighting the system. Telling yourself you're excited is working with it. The arousal is already there. The only question is what story you attach to it. The word stress itself does part of the damage. Language shapes experience more than people are comfortable admitting. When you call something stressful, you've already framed it as something being done to you, an external force producing an unwanted internal state. That framing positions you as a recipient of the experience rather than a participant in it. Swap the word. Call it pressure. Call it intensity. Call it a high-stakes situation. These aren't euphemisms. They're more accurate descriptions that happen to produce different neurological responses. The situation hasn't changed. Your relationship to it has. Stress frequently means you're doing something that matters. This sounds like a consolation prize, and it isn't. If your life produced no stress, it would mean you were taking no risks, making no commitments, attempting nothing with uncertain outcomes. The complete absence of stress is not peace. It is stagnation with good lighting. The discomfort of meaningful work, meaningful relationships, meaningful ambition. This is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that something is real. I still catch myself, in the middle of something genuinely difficult, reaching for the interpretation that something is wrong with me for finding it difficult. Old habit. The accurate interpretation is usually, this is hard because it matters. Those are not the same thing, and conflating them is expensive. The reframe has to be honest to work. This is where people go wrong with positive reframing. They try to convince themselves of things they don't actually believe. You cannot tell yourself a high-stakes presentation is no big deal and expect your nervous system to comply. It knows better. What you can tell yourself accurately is that your nervous system is preparing you for performance, that the elevated state you're in is appropriate for the significance of the situation, that the discomfort is not evidence of inadequacy, it's evidence of engagement. These things are true. And because they're true, the nervous system has less to argue with. There's a specific cognitive distortion that stress activates reliably, catastrophizing. the tendency to take the worst possible interpretation of available information and treat it as the most likely one. Under stress, the brain's threat detection system is running hot, which means it flags ambiguous signals as dangerous by default. The email with a curt tone becomes evidence of imminent firing. The miscommunication becomes proof the relationship is damaged. The mistake becomes confirmation of fundamental incompetence. None of these conclusions are supported by the evidence. All of them feel completely certain when you're stressed. The antidote to catastrophizing isn't optimism, it's specificity. What do I actually know? What is confirmed versus assumed? What is the most likely explanation for this, not the most threatening one? These questions don't require you to pretend things are fine. They require you to be accurate rather than dramatic. Accuracy under stress is an act of discipline. Difficulty is not punishment. This sounds simple. It lands differently when you're in the middle of something genuinely hard and your nervous system is generating the steady background signal that this shouldn't be happening, that you shouldn't be feeling this, that something has gone wrong with the situation or with you. That signal is not information. It's noise. Specifically, it's the noise produced by a nervous system that has been trained to expect comfort and is registering its objection to the current conditions. Retrain the expectation, not toward suffering, toward reality. Hard things happen. They are survivable. Sometimes they produce the best outcomes of your life, but only if you stay present for them rather than spending all your available energy trying to make them mean something terrible about you or the world. Same Monday. The only thing you get to choose is the universe you experience it in. Choose carefully. Your body is listening. Chapter 6. Voluntary discomfort. The cold shower doesn't get easier. You get harder. This distinction matters more than it sounds. If you're waiting for difficult things to stop feeling difficult before you engage with them, you've misunderstood the mechanism entirely. The goal is not to reach a state where discomfort is absent. The goal is to become someone for whom discomfort is no longer disqualifying. Those are completely different projects with completely different endpoints. One of them is achievable. The other one is a waiting room you never leave. The scientific principle underneath this is called hormesis. Small doses of a stressor make the organism more resistant to larger doses of that stressor. You see it in physical training. The micro tears from lifting weights trigger a repair process that builds stronger tissue. You see it in vaccination. A weakened pathogen trains the immune system to recognize and defeat the real thing. You see it in psychological resilience. Controlled exposure to manageable stress builds tolerance for uncontrolled stress. This is not metaphor. This is the actual mechanism by which organisms become more capable. Your nervous system is trainable. The question is what you're training it for. Most people are training it for avoidance. Every time you dodge a difficult conversation, your nervous system learns that difficult conversations are worth dodging. Every time you abandon a commitment when it gets uncomfortable, the discomfort threshold lowers slightly. Every time you choose the easier option, not because it's better, but because the harder one feels bad, you are running a training session. You are teaching your nervous system exactly how much friction it takes to make you stop. And your nervous system, being an excellent student, remembers. Voluntary discomfort is the counter-training. It's the deliberate, systematic practice of choosing the harder thing. Not because you enjoy suffering, not to perform toughness for anyone watching, but because you understand that the capacity to tolerate difficulty is built through tolerating difficulty. There is no other way. You cannot read your way into stress tolerance. You cannot think your way into it. You have to accumulate the lived experience of encountering something uncomfortable and discovering, repeatedly, that you survived it. The cold shower is the entry point for a lot of people. And it works not because there's anything magical about cold water, but because it provides a daily, controllable, consequence-free opportunity to practice overriding a strong physical resistance. Your body wants out. You stay. That's the whole exercise. The neurological training is in the gap between wanting to escape and choosing not to. Every morning you do that, you are practicing, in a very small, very low-stakes way, the exact psychological mechanism you'll need when the pressure is real and the stakes are not small. Physical training is stress inoculation, in the most literal sense. When you push your body past the point of comfort, hold the plank 10 seconds longer than you want to, run the last quarter mile when your legs have already filed a formal complaint. You are training your mind to continue functioning past the point of discomfort. And that lesson is not quarantined to the gym. It transfers. The person who has repeatedly chosen to continue when their body wanted to stop has a different relationship with the impulse to quit than the person who has always honored that impulse immediately. Public speaking is one of the most efficient stress training tools available, for reasons that have nothing to do with communication skills. It triggers social threat simultaneously with performance anxiety, two of the most common stress responses, in a situation that is entirely safe. Nothing catastrophic actually happens if you lose your place or your voice shakes. But your nervous system doesn't initially know that. It registers it as genuine threat. Standing there anyway, continuing, completing the thing. This is teaching your nervous system that social exposure and performance pressure are survivable. The lesson takes repetition. One speech doesn't change the wiring. 50 speeches starts to. Putting yourself in situations where you might fail is not recklessness. It's one of the more important things you can do for your stress tolerance. Because failure, specifically the fear of failure, is one of the primary drivers of avoidance. Most people don't avoid hard things because the things are hard. They avoid hard things because hard things might not work out. And not working out feels unbearable because they've had very little practice with it. Controlled failure in low-stakes environments builds familiarity with the experience. And familiarity strips away the catastrophic quality that fear attaches to it. Failure starts to become data rather than verdict. Time pressure is training that most people accidentally use against themselves. They give themselves too much time for everything, which trains their brain to associate tasks with long, leisurely timelines. Then a real deadline arrives, and the compressed timeline feels like emergency. Deliberately working against a timer, giving yourself less time than you think you need, setting artificial deadlines, practicing the particular mental state of performing under time constraint, builds a specific kind of cognitive resilience. The ability to prioritize quickly, decide with incomplete information, maintain quality under compression. These skills do not develop in spacious, unhurried conditions. Social stress deserves its own training. Most stress exposure programs focus on individual performance under pressure, but a significant portion of real-world stress is interpersonal. The difficult conversation, the disagreement with someone whose opinion matters to you, the situation where you need to hold a position against pushback. These require a different kind of tolerance than physical discomfort. They require the ability to remain regulated when another person's emotional state is trying to pull you into theirs. You build this by having the difficult conversations before you feel ready, by disagreeing in low-stakes situations, by practicing staying grounded when someone is frustrated or upset, rather than immediately defaulting to whatever makes the discomfort stop. The progressive overload principle is critical here. In physical training, you don't walk into the gym on day one and attempt the heaviest weight on the rack. You start with what you can manage and increase the load gradually. The same logic applies to stress exposure. Jump too far too fast, and you're not building resilience. You're accumulating trauma. The goal is challenge slightly beyond your current capacity, not overwhelm well beyond it. The difference matters. One expands your range, the other contracts it. Recovery is the part of this people most consistently skip. After any significant stress exposure, voluntary or otherwise, your nervous system needs time to return to baseline. This isn't weakness. This is how adaptation works. The growth happens during recovery. The stress exposure creates the stimulus. The recovery is where the organism actually changes. Skip recovery, and you don't get stronger. You get progressively more depleted until the same stressors that used to be manageable start to feel impossible. I went through a period of stacking challenges, deliberately, thinking I was building resilience. Cold exposure, hard workouts, difficult projects, uncomfortable social situations, all simultaneously, without adequate recovery between any of them. I wasn't building anything. I was just tired in an impressive variety of ways. The goal of voluntary discomfort is not to become someone who feels nothing. Discomfort will always feel uncomfortable. What changes is your response to that feeling. Instead of the automatic signal to retreat, you develop a different default. This is uncomfortable, and I can continue anyway. That default, built through repetition, is the foundation of everything. The cold shower is still cold. You just stopped letting cold be a reason. Chapter 7. Deciding fast in the dark. At some point, not deciding becomes the decision. And it's almost always the worst one. This is the thing about decision paralysis that people don't fully reckon with. The failure to choose is not a neutral act. It is itself a choice. Specifically, the choice to let circumstances determine your outcome rather than determining it yourself. While you're deliberating, the situation is moving. Options are closing. Other people are deciding. The window in which your decision would have been most effective is quietly shutting. And when you finally decide, or when the decision gets made for you by default, you're operating in a narrower space with fewer good options than you had when you started hesitating. Speed under pressure is not recklessness. This point requires some defense because the conflation of fast decisions with bad decisions is widespread and mostly wrong. Recklessness is deciding without relevant information. Speed is deciding efficiently with the information you have. These are different things. The person who deliberates endlessly is not being more careful than the person who decides quickly. They are often being more afraid. Deliberation can be genuine cognitive work. It can also be anxiety performing as thoroughness. Knowing which one you're doing is itself a skill. The research on expert decision-making is illuminating here. In high-pressure fields, emergency medicine, firefighting, military command, experienced practitioners do not make better decisions by considering more options. They make better decisions by recognizing patterns faster and acting on them with less deliberation. Gary Klein's work on naturalistic decision-making found that expert decision-makers under pressure rarely compared multiple options. They identified the first workable option and ran a quick mental simulation. If it worked in the simulation, they acted. The expertise wasn't in the analysis. It was in the pattern recognition that made extensive analysis unnecessary. This is important because it suggests that decision-making speed under pressure is not primarily about cognitive shortcuts or risk tolerance. It's about accumulated experience that makes the relevant patterns visible faster. Which means the way to make better decisions under pressure is not to think harder in the moment. It's to have more relevant experience before the moment. To have been in similar situations enough times that the pattern is familiar and the response is practiced. A framework helps when experience is thin. Under pressure, your brain wants to spin, cycling through possibilities, worst cases, competing considerations, in a loop that generates the feeling of thinking without producing the output of a decision. A framework interrupts the spin. 3 questions asked in sequence. What are my actual options right now? What is the most likely outcome of each? Which option best fits what I'm trying to accomplish? Not what feels safest, not what avoids the most criticism, what actually moves toward the goal. 3 questions. You'd be surprised how often they're sufficient. The 10-10-10 rule is useful for calibrating decision weight. How will I feel about this in 10 minutes? 10 months? 10 years? The value of this isn't the specific answers. It's the perspective shift that happens when you zoom out. Most decisions that feel enormous in the moment are irrelevant in 10 months. Recognizing that in real time reduces the weight of the decision, which reduces the anxiety around making it, which makes making it easier. Occasionally, the reverse is true. A decision that feels small in the moment turns out to have 10-year consequences. The rule helps you allocate deliberation time to the decisions that actually warrant it, rather than distributing anxiety evenly across everything. The reversibility question cuts through enormous amounts of unnecessary deliberation. Is this decision reversible or not? Reversible decisions, most of them are, should be made quickly because the cost of being wrong is low. You can adjust. You can course correct. The price of slowness here is almost always higher than the price of a suboptimal first choice. Irreversible decisions warrant more care. Career changes, major financial commitments, significant relationship choices. These are worth the deliberation time. But even irreversible decisions have a point of diminishing returns. More thinking after a certain point doesn't improve the decision. It just delays it while adding anxiety. I had a decision to make once that I spent 6 weeks thinking about. By week 3, I knew what I was going to do. The next 3 weeks were not deliberation. They were the performance of deliberation, a way of not being responsible for the choice, yet while still heading toward it. I made the same decision I would have made in week 3. I just arrived at it exhausted. The fear underneath slow decision-making is almost always the fear of being wrong, of choosing badly and having to live with that, of being the person who made the call that didn't work out. This fear is understandable and essentially useless. You will make decisions that don't work out. This is not a risk. It is a certainty. The question is not how to avoid ever being wrong. The question is how to be wrong in ways you can recover from, quickly enough that you have time to correct course. Fast decisions with active monitoring and willingness to adjust are almost always superior to slow decisions made under the illusion that enough deliberation produces certainty. Certainty is not available. Clarity is. They are different products. Intuition deserves more credit than analytical culture tends to give it. Your subconscious is processing information continuously. Patterns, anomalies, accumulated experience, at a speed your conscious mind cannot match. The feeling of knowing something before you can explain why you know it is not mysticism. It's pattern recognition operating below the level of conscious articulation. Experienced people in high-stakes fields trust it because they've discovered it's often right. Not always, not as a substitute for thinking, but as a signal worth incorporating rather than dismissing because it arrives without a memo explaining its reasoning. Decision confidence is trainable, and the training method is embarrassingly simple. Track your decisions and their outcomes. Most people have no idea whether their decisions are actually good or not because they've never systematically looked. They remember the bad calls with high emotional fidelity and forget the good ones. This produces a distorted self-assessment, the sense that you make poor decisions, that creates hesitation that produces worse decisions. Keep a record. Review it. You will almost certainly discover that your decision-making is better than your anxiety about it suggests. That evidence builds the confidence that makes the next decision faster. The person who decides well under pressure is not someone who has eliminated uncertainty. Uncertainty cannot be eliminated. They are someone who has become comfortable operating inside it, who has accepted that the map is always incomplete and learned to navigate anyway. The dark is not going away. Get better at moving through it. Chapter 8. Systems that think for you. Surgeons use checklists, not because they're forgetful, because they're human. This is the part that tends to sting a little, because most people believe that when something really matters, they will rise to the occasion. They will focus harder, think more carefully, perform at their best precisely because the stakes are high. This belief is flattering and consistently wrong. What the research on human performance under pressure shows repeatedly is that people don't rise to the occasion. They fall to their level of preparation. And when that preparation consists of good intentions and general competence, rather than specific systems and practiced protocols, the fall is often significant. Atul Gawande documented this in surgical settings, environments populated by highly trained, deeply experienced professionals operating on problems they'd spent careers mastering. Checklists reduced preventable deaths, not because surgeons were incompetent, because stress, fatigue, time pressure, and cognitive load create conditions in which even competent people miss things. The checklist doesn't require the surgeon to be at peak performance. It works despite impaired performance. That's the entire value proposition. This is what a good system does. It doesn't ask your stressed, cognitively compromised, emotionally activated self to perform at full capacity. It asks that self to follow a structure that was designed by your calm, clear, well-resourced self. The two selves have very different capabilities. The calm self can build things the stressed self cannot. The stressed self can follow things the calm self already built. The transfer of responsibility between them is the mechanism. Most people never make the transfer explicit. Stress does specific, predictable things to cognition. It narrows attention. You see the immediate problem clearly and miss everything peripheral. It impairs working memory. The capacity to hold multiple pieces of information in mind simultaneously degrades under pressure. It accelerates decision-making in ways that increase error rates. It activates emotional processing at the expense of analytical processing. None of this is character weakness. It is the neurological cost of operating in threat mode. Your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. The problem is that what it evolved to do is not always what the situation requires. Systems compensate for these specific impairments. A checklist compensates for impaired working memory. You don't have to hold all the steps in your head because they're written down. A communication protocol compensates for narrowed attention. You've already decided in advance what information needs to go where, so you don't have to figure it out while also managing the crisis. A decision framework compensates for accelerated, error-prone judgment. You've pre-committed to a process, so you don't have to construct one under pressure. The system is doing the cognitive work that the stressed brain cannot reliably do for itself. Start with your most frequent stress triggers. Not your worst ones, your most frequent ones. The situations that reliably compromise your performance. The recurring pressures that you keep navigating the same inefficient way because you've never built a better structure for them. These are your highest leverage targets for system design. If deadline pressure consistently derails you, design a deadline management system that breaks large deliverables into daily components small enough that no single day carries catastrophic weight. If difficult conversations consistently go badly, create a conversation framework. Not a script, but a structure. How you'll open, what you're trying to accomplish, what you'll do if it escalates. A structure you've thought through in advance rather than improvised under fire. The design principle that matters most is simplicity under duress. This is where most systems fail. People design systems at peak cognitive capacity and produce something elegant and comprehensive that requires peak cognitive capacity to operate. Then stress arrives, cognitive capacity drops, and the system becomes inaccessible at precisely the moment it's needed. A good stress system is one you can follow when you're tired, scared, overwhelmed, or all three simultaneously. If executing the system requires you to be at your best, it is not a stress system. It is a performance system for good days. Checklists feel beneath people who consider themselves competent. This is a pride problem masquerading as a capability assessment. The resistance to checklists, "I don't need that, I know what I'm doing," is not evidence of superior competence. It is evidence of a specific cognitive bias called the illusion of explanatory depth, the tendency to believe you understand processes more thoroughly than you actually do until you're required to execute them under pressure and discover the gaps. The checklist reveals what you thought you knew. Sometimes those are the same thing. Often they aren't. Your environment needs to be part of the system. When stress is high, you default to whatever is easiest, whatever requires the least activation energy to access. This means your environment's design is effectively making decisions for you during high-stress periods. If healthy food is harder to access than unhealthy food, you will eat poorly when stressed. If your workspace is disorganized, you will work inefficiently when overwhelmed. If your phone is within reach, you will reach for it when your focus needs to be elsewhere. Environmental design is not interior decoration. It is decision architecture. The goal is to make the choices that serve you easier to make than the choices that don't. Under stress, easier usually wins. Automate the decisions that don't require you. Every decision you make depletes a finite cognitive resource. Decision fatigue is real and measurable. In high-stress periods, that resource is already compromised. Every automated bill payment, every pre-planned meal, every default response template, every pre-committed routine removes a decision from the stack. The fewer decisions you're making on routine matters, the more cognitive capacity remains for the decisions that actually require your full attention. This is not laziness. It is resource allocation. The surgeon conserving hand strength before an operation is not being lazy. They are being intelligent about finite resources. Backup plans deserve more systematic attention than they usually receive. Most people have a primary plan and optimism. This works until the primary plan fails, at which point they are constructing a backup plan under exactly the conditions least suited to constructing anything. Under pressure, with depleted resources, and with the added cognitive load of managing the fact that the primary plan has failed. The backup plan built in advance doesn't require any of that. It was built when you were calm. You execute it without construction cost. If your primary income source becomes precarious, you should know before it becomes precarious what your next move is. Not because catastrophizing is healthy, because having thought it through costs almost nothing, and not having thought it through can cost a great deal. Test your systems before you need them. This seems obvious and is almost universally skipped. People build protocols, file them away, and discover under pressure that the protocol has gaps they never noticed because they've never actually run through it. A fire drill is not about believing there will be a fire. It's about discovering whether the system works when you're not under pressure, so you can fix it before you are. Walk through your stress protocols during calm periods. Find the gaps. They are there. Better to find them on a Tuesday afternoon than at 2 in the morning when everything is actually on fire. I once built what I was certain was a comprehensive contingency plan for a project. Detailed. Thorough. Never tested it. When I needed it, Step 4 referred to a resource that no longer existed. Steps 4 through 9 were consequently useless. The plan looked excellent. It had a gap I would have found in 10 minutes if I'd ever run through it once. Document everything that matters. Not for bureaucratic reasons, because your memory under stress is not the same as your memory under calm. The things you are certain you will remember are frequently the things you forget precisely when you need them. Written systems don't forget. They don't get distorted by anxiety. They don't get overwritten by the urgency of the moment. They sit there exactly as you wrote them, available when your memory has become unreliable. The goal is not to systematize your entire existence. The goal is to ensure that the situations where you most need to perform well and are most likely to be cognitively compromised are the situations where you are least dependent on real-time cognitive performance. Your best thinking has already been done. The system is just making sure it shows up. Chapter 9. Pressure as performance fuel. Every elite performer in human history was scared. They just decided that meant something different. Not that the fear was gone. Not that they'd transcended the nervous system's insistence on registering high stakes as threat. The fear was present, often intensely so. What differed was the interpretation, the fraction of a second cognitive move that took the identical physiological signal and routed it toward performance rather than paralysis. Same signal. Different destination, completely different outcome. This is not a gift. It is a learned skill. And it is learnable by anyone willing to understand what pressure actually is before deciding what it means. Pressure is energy. That's the most accurate description available. The stress response floods your system with chemical fuel, cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine, that increases cardiovascular output, sharpens sensory processing, accelerates reaction time, and mobilizes physical resources. Your body is doing something extraordinary when it's under pressure. It is shifting into a higher operating mode, not a damaged mode, not a broken mode, a higher one. The question is not how to turn it off. The question is how to aim it. Most people aim it inward. The energy of pressure, unredirected, becomes self-monitoring. Am I doing this right? Do I look nervous? What if this goes badly? What do they think of me? The attention that should be going outward, toward the task, the problem, the opportunity, loops back inward and consumes itself. Performance suffers not because pressure impaired the person's capability, but because the person's attention went to the wrong place. This is choking. And choking is almost always a misrouting of attention, not a failure of ability. The redirect is the skill. taking the elevated energy that pressure creates and pointing it at execution rather than self-evaluation. This sounds simple. It requires practice because the pull towards self-monitoring under pressure is strong. It's the brain doing threat assessment, checking for social danger, running risk calculations. All of that is useful in genuinely threatening social situations. In performance situations, it is mostly noise that needs to be overridden with process focus. Process focus is the most reliable performance tool available under pressure, and the one most consistently abandoned when stakes rise. When the outcome matters, people focus on the outcome. This is intuitive and counterproductive. Outcome focus under pressure does two things simultaneously. It increases the felt weight of the situation, which increases anxiety, which degrades performance, and it directs attention away from the process that actually produces good outcomes. The athlete who focuses on winning tightens up. The athlete who focuses on the next step, executed well, performs. The outcome is the same goal. The focus is completely different, and the focus determines the state, which determines the execution, which determines the outcome. Pre-performance routines exist for a specific neurological reason that most people who use them don't fully understand. They're not superstition. They're not habit for its own sake. They are state change protocols, sequences of behavior that reliably produce a specific psychological state through repetition and association. The basketball player who bounces the ball 3 times before a free throw is not performing a ritual. They are activating a conditioned state, the focused, regulated, execution-ready state that has been present every time that sequence has occurred. The routine is a trigger for a state. Build the association deliberately, and the trigger becomes reliable. Walk into a high-pressure situation and run your protocol. Your nervous system knows what state follows. Visualization is training that most people either dismiss entirely or misuse. The dismissal usually comes from association with vague, positive thinking practices, imagining good outcomes as a substitute for preparation. That's not what visualization is. Mental rehearsal activates the same neural pathways as physical practice. Brain imaging studies show nearly identical neurological activity when an action is performed and when it is vividly imagined. This means visualization is not a supplement to preparation. It is preparation, a form of practice that can be done anywhere, requires no equipment, and has measurable effects on performance. The misuse is visualizing outcomes rather than process. Seeing yourself succeeding is pleasant and largely inert. Seeing yourself executing each specific step of a high-pressure situation, the difficult conversation, the presentation, the negotiation, encountering resistance, staying regulated, continuing to execute. This is training. The vividness matters. The specificity matters. The inclusion of difficulty matters. If your visualization contains no obstacles, you are not preparing for the actual situation. You are imagining a better version of it. There is a phenomenon that performance psychologists call the challenge-threat continuum. When your brain appraises a high-stakes situation, it is running a rapid calculation, comparing the demands of the situation against the resources available to meet them. If resources seem adequate or greater than demands, the brain registers challenge. If demands seem to exceed resources, the brain registers threat. These two states produce different physiological responses. Challenge produces a cardiovascular profile associated with efficient performance, increased cardiac output, decreased vascular resistance. Threat produces a profile associated with defensive posturing, increased vascular resistance, preparation for damage limitation rather than peak output. The same situation can produce either response depending on how your brain runs the calculation, which means you can influence the calculation. Not by pretending the demands are smaller than they are, by genuinely expanding your sense of available resources. Preparation expands resources. The more you've practiced, the more capable your brain correctly assesses you to be. Support expands resources. Knowing you have people you can call changes the calculation. Physical readiness expands resources. A rested, physically capable body reads as more resourced than a depleted one. Each of these shifts the appraisal. Each of them moves you along the continuum from threat toward challenge. Artificial pressure in practice is one of the most underused performance tools available. Most practice happens in comfortable conditions. Enough time, low stakes, supportive environment. Then the real performance happens under pressure, and the gap between practice conditions and performance conditions creates a shock that degrades execution. Practice under artificial pressure closes the gap. Time yourself. Perform in front of others. Create stakes. Compete. Add consequences to practice situations that would otherwise have none. Your nervous system needs to have experienced the pressure state in a practice context to know how to function in it during the real one. I gave a presentation once that I'd prepared extensively for in private. Rehearsed it alone, knew the material thoroughly, felt genuinely ready. The moment there were actual people in the room, a completely different cognitive state arrived that I'd never practiced in. The preparation was for a situation that didn't exist. High-pressure situations often reveal capabilities that comfortable ones never would. The pressure to find a solution, to perform, to deliver. This forces a depth of engagement that routine circumstances don't require. Some of the most creative thinking, the most incisive problem-solving, the most precise execution people are capable of happens under significant pressure. Not despite it, because of it. The pressure is providing something comfort cannot. The urgency, the focus, the full mobilization of resources that transforms ordinary performance into something better. This doesn't happen automatically. It happens when the pressure is aimed correctly. When you're trained enough that the elevated state amplifies your preparation rather than exposing your lack of it. When your attention goes to execution rather than evaluation. When the same signal your nervous system has been sending about threat gets rerouted by practice and intention toward fuel. The fear is still there. You just stop treating it like a problem. Chapter 10, Becoming the Calm in the Room. Panic is contagious. So is calm. Most people only remember the first part. There's a reason crowds stampede and boardrooms spiral, and families in crisis produce more crisis. Emotional states propagate. Not metaphorically, neurologically. Mirror neurons, limbic resonance, co-regulation of nervous systems. When you are in close proximity to someone in a heightened emotional state, your own nervous system begins to mirror it. This is not weakness. It is the biological machinery of social bonding operating exactly as designed. The same mechanism that allows you to feel another person's joy is the one that pulls you into their panic. You cannot turn it off. You can only understand it well enough to work with it deliberately, which means the person who walks into a crisis already regulated is not just managing their own stress. They are actively influencing the stress level of everyone in the room. Their nervous system is broadcasting a signal. Calm is transmissible. And in a room full of people whose nervous systems are pulling each other toward higher activation, one regulated person can shift the entire system's trajectory. Not through authority, not through commands to calm down, which never work and frequently backfire. Through the simple, powerful fact of being a stable reference point in an unstable environment. This is what it means to be the eye of the storm. Not the absence of intensity, the center of it, the place where things are still. It requires something most people find uncomfortable: being less reactive than the situation seems to warrant. When everyone around you is escalating, matching their energy feels appropriate. It feels like taking the situation seriously. It feels like solidarity. It is none of those things. It is entrainment. Your nervous system synchronizing with the dominant emotional frequency in the environment. And an environment in which everyone has synchronized to panic produces worse outcomes than one in which at least one person remained calibrated. The physical signals matter before the words do. People are reading your body before they're processing your sentences. Your pace of movement, your posture, the steadiness of your hands, the rhythm of your speech. These signals arrive faster than semantic content and carry more weight in a crisis. Because in a crisis, the nervous system is scanning for threat cues, not linguistic meaning. If your body is communicating chaos, rapid movement, tension, the micro-expressions of someone who is frightened, the room receives that before you've said a word. If your body is communicating steadiness, it creates a neurological permission structure for others to begin regulating toward that. Slow your speech when everyone else is speeding up. This is harder than it sounds because the pull is strong. Fast speech surrounds you, urgency fills the room, and matching the pace feels natural. Deliberate deceleration feels almost rude. It isn't. Slow speech in a fast-moving situation does several things simultaneously. It forces whoever is listening to slow their processing to match yours. It communicates that you are not panicked, because panicked people cannot maintain deliberate speech rhythm. It models a cognitive pace that produces better thinking than the one currently running in the room. You are not just speaking slowly. You are setting a different tempo for how the situation gets processed. Questions regulate better than statements in a crisis. When people are activated, direct statements, even accurate, helpful ones, can land as challenges to be defended against, rather than information to be used. The threat-activated brain is not optimally configured for receiving information. It is configured for defending position. A well-placed question bypasses that defense. What do we know for certain right now? What's our next immediate step? What resources do we have available? These questions are not rhetorical. They direct the group's attention toward the actionable and away from the catastrophic. They create cognitive movement in a useful direction rather than the circular, amplifying movement that unguided anxiety produces. There is a difference between being calm and performing calm. The performance, the studied stillness, the deliberate voice, the carefully composed expression maintained through effort, is exhausting and usually visible. People sense the effort underneath it, and it produces a faint but real unease. Genuine regulation is different. It's not the suppression of internal activation. It's the management of it, being activated and remaining functional, feeling the urgency and not being hijacked by it. The difference is internal, but it reads externally. Performed calm has a quality of distance to it. Real regulation has a quality of presence. Under stress, people can tell the difference even when they can't articulate it. Listening becomes a leadership act when stress is high. The instinct in a crisis is toward action, toward output, toward doing something visible that demonstrates engagement with the problem. But when people are frightened or overwhelmed, the thing they most need before they can think clearly is to feel heard. Not agreed with, not fixed. Heard. There is a neurological basis for this. Co-regulation through attunement, the process by which one nervous system calms another through the experience of being received rather than managed. When you listen without rushing to fix, without steering toward your preferred solution, without signaling impatience with the emotional content of what's being expressed, you are doing something that looks passive and is actually profoundly active. You are helping another nervous system down-regulate enough to think. Redirecting to what's controllable is one of the most practically useful things you can do in a group that's spiraling. Stress and anxiety direct attention toward threat, toward what's wrong, what might go wrong, who's to blame, how bad it could get. This attention is magnetic in groups. One person catastrophizes and others follow, each contribution to the worst-case narrative pulling the group's collective focus further from productive action. A calm redirect, not dismissing the concern but shifting the question, moves the energy differently. We understand what the problem is. What can we actually do right now? This is not toxic positivity. It is triage. You are not pretending the problem doesn't exist. You are refusing to let the problem be the only thing that exists. The aftermath matters as much as the event. How a group processes a difficult period, whether it's examined honestly, whether people feel their experience was acknowledged, whether lessons get captured, determines how that group handles the next one. The eye of the storm isn't just a crisis role, it's an ongoing function. Following up, checking in, creating space for the processing that doesn't happen automatically. The person who was the steady point during the crisis and then disappears afterward leaves an incomplete experience. The person who stays present through the recovery communicates something important, that the stability was not a performance for the crisis. It was a characteristic. I was in a situation once where things went badly in a way that affected a lot of people. I stayed regulated through the acute phase, genuinely not performed. Then, when it was over, I exhausted myself trying to make sure everyone else was okay and completely neglected to process any of it myself. I was the eye of the storm until the storm passed, and then I was just a person who hadn't dealt with anything, talking to people about their feelings. The limitation is real and worth naming. You cannot be a stable reference point for others from a position of depletion. The oxygen mask instruction on airplanes is not selfishness dressed as wisdom. It is systems thinking. A regulated person can help regulate others. A depleted person, regardless of their intentions, is drawing from a resource that isn't there. Being the calm in the room requires being genuinely calm. Not performed calm, not suppressed panic, not deferred breakdown, which means that being useful to others under pressure is downstream of doing your own work first. The room is always looking for a signal. Give it the right one. Chapter 11. How you recover determines how you hold up. Most people treat recovery like it's an indulgence. Their stress totals tell the truth. There is a particular kind of person who is very good at getting through hard things and very bad at what comes after. They push through the crisis with genuine competence, steady, functional, effective. And then when it's over, they immediately move to the next thing. No processing. No deliberate restoration. Just a brief exhale, and then forward momentum into whatever is next. Because stopping feels like weakness, and rest feels like something you earn after you've done enough, which is a threshold that never quite arrives. These people tend to be admired. They also tend to accumulate stress the way a building accumulates structural damage, invisibly, incrementally, until something that should be manageable produces a crack that seems disproportionate to the load. The crack isn't disproportionate. The load has been building for years. They just never looked at the accounting. Recovery is not the opposite of performance. It is a component of it. The failure to understand this distinction is responsible for a significant amount of unnecessary breakdown in otherwise capable people. Elite athletes don't treat rest as laziness. They treat it as training, the phase in which the adaptation actually occurs, the period where the body integrates the stress exposure and builds back stronger. Remove the recovery, and you don't get more performance. You get progressive degradation. The same biology applies to psychological and cognitive performance. The stress creates the stimulus. The recovery is where you actually change. The first thing to understand about recovery is that it doesn't begin automatically when the stressor stops. Your nervous system doesn't immediately register that the threat is over. Stress hormones linger. The autonomic nervous system remains in elevated mode. The physiological state of threat persists past the end of the threatening situation, sometimes for hours, sometimes longer, depending on the intensity and duration of the stress, which means that walking away from a difficult period does not equal recovering from it. The recovery has to be actively initiated. Breathing is the fastest available intervention. Not eventually, and not as a long-term practice, but immediately. The deliberate shift to slow, extended exhale breathing begins activating the parasympathetic nervous system within seconds. You are not waiting for calm to arrive. You are signaling the system that it is safe to begin the transition. 10 minutes of focused breathing after a high-stress period does more actual physiological work than an hour of distraction. The distraction lets you not think about it. The breathing lets your nervous system process it. Movement processes what sitting cannot. Stress hormones are fuel for physical action that never happened. They don't neutralize through stillness. They metabolize through movement. A walk, light stretching, easy swimming. The goal is not cardiovascular training. It's chemistry. You are completing the stress cycle that the situation activated, but your sedentary response to it never finished. Peter Levine's work on somatic stress processing makes this point in clinical detail. Unresolved physiological activation from stress remains in the body until it is physically discharged. The animals in the wild that survive a predator encounter shake, literally shake. Then they go back to grazing. They don't ruminate. They complete the cycle physically and return to baseline. Humans have largely lost this. We sit with the activation and wonder why we feel unsettled for days. Sleep during recovery is not rest. It is reconstruction. During sleep, specifically during deep, slow-wave sleep and REM, the brain processes emotional memories, consolidates learned experiences, clears metabolic waste products accumulated during waking stress, and restores neurotransmitter balance. Matthew Walker's research on sleep and emotional processing found that REM sleep specifically functions as overnight emotional therapy, processing the emotional charge of difficult experiences and integrating them as memory without the original acute distress. This is not metaphor. This is a specific neurological function that only occurs during sleep. The person who stays up late after a stressful period, working, scrolling, not sleeping, is actively preventing their brain from doing the thing that would make them more capable of handling tomorrow. Nutrition in recovery gets treated as either completely irrelevant or as comfort, which usually means food that provides temporary relief and slows actual restoration. Stress depletes specific nutrients at measurable rates. Vitamin C is depleted by cortisol. B vitamins are consumed by the nervous system under sustained activation. Magnesium drops under stress, and its deficiency produces anxiety, which extends the stress response. Omega-3 fatty acids support the neurological repair processes that recovery requires. This is not a supplement sales pitch. It is biochemistry. What you eat after a significant stress period either provides the raw materials for restoration or it doesn't. Junk food provides comfort. Whole food provides reconstruction. The mental component of recovery is where most people do the least work and pay the highest cost. Stress experiences, unprocessed, don't file themselves neatly away. They linger as rumination, as heightened reactivity to similar triggers, as vague unease that attaches itself to unrelated situations. Processing is not the same as dwelling. Dwelling is repetitive, unresolved cycling through the same emotional content without movement. Processing is deliberate engagement with the experience in a way that extracts meaning, integrates the emotional content, and arrives at a different relationship with what happened. Journaling does this for many people. Conversation with someone trusted does it for others. Therapy for complex or traumatic stress. The specific method matters less than the fact of doing it, rather than relying on time to do it automatically. Time does not heal. Time passes. Healing requires something happening during the time. There is a concept in psychology called post-traumatic growth, the empirically documented phenomenon of people emerging from significant stress or trauma with expanded capabilities, clearer values, deeper relationships, and greater psychological resilience than they had before the experience. This is real. It is also not automatic. The research is specific about what produces it. Deliberate processing of the experience, meaning-making, social support during recovery, and the integration of the experience into an updated self-narrative. The same experience that produces post-traumatic growth in one person produces prolonged dysfunction in another. The difference is not the experience, it is the recovery. Making major decisions during the initial recovery period is an underappreciated source of bad outcomes. The brain in the first days after significant stress is measurably different from the brain in baseline state. More negatively biased, more risk-averse in some domains, and reckless in others. More likely to make emotion-based choices that feel like clear-headed ones. Important decisions made in this window often have the quality of reactions, responses to the stress experience rather than genuine assessments of the situation. Give yourself a few days at minimum. The urgency you feel is usually the stress talking. The gradual return matters more than people expect. The instinct after a recovery period, once you feel somewhat better, is to immediately return to full intensity. The baseline was busy. The baseline had many demands. The sense of having fallen behind during the recovery period creates pressure to make up lost ground quickly. This is how secondary stress collapses people who survived the primary stress intact. Your system hasn't fully restored, even when you feel better. The feeling better precedes the actual restoration by days. Re-entry too fast depletes reserves that weren't yet rebuilt and leaves you more vulnerable to the next stressor than you were before the first one. I took a week of genuine recovery after a particularly difficult period once. Real recovery, not just absence from the acute situation. Slept properly, moved, processed, ate like a person who valued their own functioning. I came back to work with a quality of attention I hadn't had in months. I hadn't noticed how depleted I'd been because depleted had become normal. Recovery revealed what baseline was supposed to feel like. The goal of recovery is not to return to who you were before the stress hit. That person was pre-experience. Before the stress taught you something, before the difficulty revealed capacities you didn't know you had, before the pressure forced adaptations that expanded your range. The goal of recovery is to integrate the experience and arrive somewhere better than where you started. Not just restored. Rebuilt. Chapter 12, The Long Game, Stress Immunity. You're either building stress tolerance right now or spending it. There is no neutral. This is the sentence most people would prefer not to be true. The neutral position is appealing. The idea that ordinary days are rest days from the project of resilience, that you're neither advancing nor retreating, that the absence of active effort is a kind of maintenance. It isn't. Your stress tolerance is a biological system that responds to inputs continuously. Every day you are either adding to its capacity or drawing it down. The inputs are your sleep, your movement, your nutrition, your cognitive habits, your relationships, your financial decisions, your daily exposure to manageable difficulty. None of these are neutral. They are all votes. The metaphor that works best here is not a savings account, where deposits accumulate passively and earn interest while you do nothing. It's closer to physical fitness. A savings account doesn't deteriorate if you stop adding to it. Fitness does. Stop training for 3 weeks, and measurable capacity is lost. Resume training, and it returns, faster than it was built initially, thanks to muscle memory, but the return requires work. Stress immunity is the same system, built through consistent input, maintained through consistent input, deteriorating when the input stops. Most people discover this in reverse. They go through a demanding period, high stress, poor sleep, no exercise, nutrition abandoned to convenience, and emerge from it noticeably more fragile than they entered. Things that were manageable before now feel difficult. Reactions that were calibrated are now hair trigger. The recovery from ordinary friction takes longer. They attribute this to the stress itself. The stress contributed, but the deterioration of their immunity during the period, the letting go of every practice that built resilience, precisely when those practices were most needed, is what made the stress expensive. Daily meditation is one of the most studied interventions in stress immunity research, and one of the most consistently avoided by people who would benefit most from it. The avoidance usually comes packaged as skepticism. It sounds vague. It sounds like something specific demographics do. It doesn't feel like a real intervention for real problems. What the research actually shows is neurological remodeling over time. Consistent meditation practice measurably increases gray matter density in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive function, emotional regulation, and decision-making under pressure. It measurably reduces amygdala reactivity, the hair-trigger threat response that makes stress feel bigger than it is. These are structural changes, not mood changes, not attitude shifts. Changes to the physical architecture of the brain that determine how it processes stress. 10 minutes daily produces these effects over months, not hours of cross-legged silence. 10 minutes of training attention, practicing the return of focus when it wanders, developing the capacity to observe thoughts without being controlled by them, building the neurological infrastructure of equanimity through repetition. The specific technique matters less than the consistency. Walking meditation, breath focus, body scan, open awareness. The mechanism is the same across all of them. You are training your brain to have a different default relationship with activation. That training compounds quietly for months, and then one day you notice that things which used to hijack your system no longer do. And you cannot point to a specific moment when that changed, because it changed gradually, invisibly, through repetition. Physical exercise builds stress immunity at the cellular level in ways that are worth understanding specifically. Regular aerobic exercise increases the production of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein that supports the growth and maintenance of neurons and has been called miracle-grow for the brain. It improves the efficiency of the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system that regulates the stress response, making activation faster, more appropriate, and recovery to baseline quicker. It increases the production of endorphins and serotonin, which provide direct mood and resilience benefits. And it creates a controlled, repeated stress and recovery cycle that trains the entire physiological system to handle stress more efficiently. Exercise is not a lifestyle upgrade. It is the most available and most consistently underutilized stress immunity tool in existence. The type of exercise produces different immunity benefits. Cardiovascular exercise develops the system's capacity to handle sustained physiological stress and return to baseline. Strength training builds physical confidence, the felt sense of capability that transfers to psychological domains, and hormonal profiles associated with resilience. High-intensity interval training specifically trains the spike and recovery cycle, producing rapid adaptation to acute stress exposure. Yoga and slow movement practices develop the parasympathetic activation that underlies genuine calm rather than performed calm. A complete stress immunity program includes all of these, but the most important variable is not variety, it is consistency. Moderate exercise every day beats intense exercise whenever you get around to it by a considerable margin. Sleep consistency, not just duration but regularity, is a stress immunity factor that operates through circadian rhythm regulation. Your body's stress hormone release, immune function, emotional processing, and cognitive performance are all synchronized to a circadian clock. Irregular sleep schedules, varying bedtimes, inconsistent wake times, weekend schedule shifts disrupt this clock and create a persistent, low-level physiological dysregulation that makes you more reactive to stress and slower to recover from it. The person who sleeps 7 hours on a consistent schedule handles stress differently than the person who sleeps 9 hours on a chaotic one. The quantity is similar. The regulatory benefit is not. Nutritional consistency creates a baseline physiological environment that is either resistant to stress or vulnerable to it. Processed food and refined sugar create glycemic instability, blood sugar swings that produce internal physiological stress your body cannot distinguish from external threat. Over time, a diet that creates chronic internal stress depletes the systems that handle external stress. Whole foods, stable blood sugar, adequate protein, and sufficient micronutrients create an internal environment that supports stress regulation rather than burdening it. You cannot out-meditate a bad diet. The nervous system runs on chemistry, and chemistry runs on what you eat. Cognitive practices build mental immunity that physical practices alone cannot. Regularly examining and challenging negative thought patterns, not through toxic positivity, but through rigorous, honest assessment, reduces susceptibility to the cognitive distortions that stress activates. Gratitude practice, done genuinely rather than performatively, builds a neurological counterweight to the negativity bias that stress amplifies. Studying how others have navigated adversity through biography, philosophy, literature, builds perspective that makes your own difficulties feel proportionate rather than unprecedented. These practices are often dismissed as soft. They are building specific neurological infrastructure. The dismissal is itself a cognitive habit worth examining. Social connection is a stress immunity factor with a stronger evidence base than most people realize. The Harvard study of adult development, one of the longest-running studies of human well-being in existence, tracking participants for over 80 years, found that the quality of close relationships was the single strongest predictor of late-life health and happiness. Stronger than wealth, stronger than fame, stronger than intelligence. The mechanism is partly psychological. Feeling supported reduces the subjective intensity of stress, and partly physiological. Social connection produces oxytocin, which directly downregulates the stress response. The lonely person and the connected person face the same objective stressor. Their nervous systems experience it differently. The financial dimension of stress immunity gets addressed last, not because it's least important, but because it requires the most honest self-confrontation. Financial precarity is one of the most reliable sources of chronic stress. The always-on, background-level activation that depletes resilience without ever fully resolving. An emergency fund of 3 to 6 months of expenses converts acute financial stress into manageable inconvenience. Living below your means creates margin that prevents the compounding financial stress that occurs when there's no buffer between income and obligations. Multiple income streams reduce the existential vulnerability of depending entirely on one source. These are not wealth-building strategies. They are stress immunity strategies. The calm that comes from financial margin is not about money. It's about cognitive resources that chronic money stress would otherwise be consuming. Building stress immunity requires confronting the gap between what you know you should do and what you actually do. Most people know they should sleep consistently, exercise regularly, eat well, meditate, maintain relationships, and manage their finances prudently. The knowledge is not the problem. The consistency is. And the consistency problem is downstream of a motivation problem that comes from not fully reckoning with the stakes. The stakes are this: every day you don't build immunity, you are more vulnerable than you were the day before to a world that is not going to become less demanding to accommodate your lack of preparation. The next crisis is not waiting for you to be ready. It is indifferent to your readiness. What you build now is what you'll have then. That's the whole argument. Build now. Chapter 13. Teaching it without ruining it. Rescuing people from manageable stress is one of the most affectionate ways to make them fragile. This is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath a significant amount of well-intentioned helping. The parent who solves every problem before the child has to sit with it. The manager who steps in the moment a team member looks uncertain. The friend who immediately offers solutions when someone needs to find their own. The intention is kindness. The effect, accumulated over time, is the quiet erosion of someone else's confidence in their own capacity. You are teaching them, through repeated demonstration, that difficulty requires rescue, and they are learning the lesson. Real mentorship in stress resilience is mostly an exercise in restraint. Not the cold, withholding kind. The kind that comes from genuinely understanding that the discomfort someone is experiencing is not damage, it is development. And interrupting it, however kindly, interrupts the development along with it. The teaching happens in two modes, and most people only use one. The first is explicit, conversations, frameworks, direct instruction. The second is implicit, what people observe you doing when things are hard. The implicit mode is more powerful by a significant margin. People do not learn stress resilience primarily from being told about it. They learn it from watching someone they respect navigate difficulty in a way that suggests difficulty is navigable. Your example doesn't just demonstrate a skill, it grants permission. It makes the possibility real in a way that description cannot. This is worth sitting with. Every time you stay regulated when you could visibly fall apart. Every time you make a clear decision when others are frozen. Every time you recover from a setback without extended drama, someone in your orbit is watching and updating their model of what's possible. Not because you're performing for them, because you're doing the thing, and they're seeing that it can be done. That observation is more instructive than any framework you could hand them. Teaching stress fundamentals works best in calm, and almost no one does it in calm. The conversations about how to handle pressure tend to happen during pressure, when someone is already activated, already narrowed cognitively, already in the state that is least receptive to learning. You are trying to install software while the system is crashing. The fundamentals, breathing techniques, the pause, reframing, physical stress regulation need to be introduced and practiced before they're needed. In the ordinary moments, over coffee. During the debrief after something minor, not in the middle of something major. Seeds planted in calm grow into capacity during storms. Seeds thrown into the storm accomplish very little. Helping someone identify their personal stress pattern is one of the most useful things you can do for them, and it requires genuine observation rather than generic advice. People respond to stress in idiosyncratic ways. Some accelerate, they move faster, talk more, fill every silence with action. Some withdraw, they go quiet, become unavailable, remove themselves from the situation. Some intellectualize. They analyze at length while systematically avoiding the emotional content. Some externalize. They find the source of the problem in everyone and everything except themselves. None of these patterns is inherently wrong. All of them have costs when they run automatically. The person who can recognize their own pattern has something the person who can't does not: the possibility of intervening in it. You can help someone see their pattern when you've observed it clearly and can name it without judgment. Judgment is the thing that closes the door. When someone handles stress badly, reacts poorly, makes a worse situation worse, falls apart in a way that creates collateral damage, the evaluative response shuts down the learning. They become defensive rather than reflective. The question that opens the door is not what went wrong with you, but what happened for you in that moment. The shift is from verdict to curiosity. It invites examination rather than defense. And examination is where the learning actually lives. Decision-making frameworks transfer better than specific decisions. This is a distinction that matters enormously in stress mentorship and gets collapsed constantly. When someone you're supporting faces a difficult choice under pressure, the instinct is to tell them what to do. Sometimes this is appropriate, when they're too activated to access their own reasoning and need a circuit breaker. But as a default mode, it is disabling. It answers the specific question while leaving them no more capable of answering the next one. Teaching the framework. Pause before responding. Distinguish what you can control from what you can't. Consider the 10-year view. Ask what the clearest version of you would do. Leaves them with a tool rather than just an answer. The tool works on every subsequent question. The answer only works on this one. Practicing stress scenarios in low-stakes contexts is underused to a degree that borders on negligence, given how effective it is. Role-playing difficult conversations. Running through high-pressure decision scenarios. Simulating time constraints. Practicing staying regulated while someone else escalates. These exercises feel artificial, and they are artificial, which is exactly the point. The nervous system needs to have encountered a situation in some form before it can handle that situation with full capacity. The first time you experience a particular type of pressure should not be when it actually matters. It should be in a practice context where the cost of imperfect performance is nothing. The artificiality is not a bug. It is the feature. There is a version of stress mentorship that becomes about the mentor rather than the student. The need to be needed. The satisfaction of being the person others turn to. The identity investment in being someone's source of stability. This version produces dependence rather than capability. The goal of genuine stress mentorship is to make yourself unnecessary, to work toward a point where the person you're supporting can handle what they need to handle without you. This requires subordinating your own satisfaction in being useful to their long-term interest in being capable. It requires celebrating their independence rather than their reliance. It requires being glad when they don't call, because it means they handled it themselves. Knowing when to refer is a competency that separates genuine mentorship from well-intentioned overreach. Some stress responses are beyond the scope of peer support. Trauma responses, clinical anxiety, depression, PTSD. Patterns that are deeply rooted, highly disruptive, and not improving despite time and support. The person who can recognize these and say clearly, "This is beyond what I can help with," and here's someone who is doing something more useful than the person who tries to handle everything and succeeds at nothing. Your limits as a support person are not failures. They are honest assessments. And honest assessment is the foundation of everything else we've been discussing. Accountability done well is rare. Most accountability structures drift toward either useless positivity, "Great job, keep it up, you're doing amazingly," or punitive judgment when the person falls short. Neither produces growth. Useful accountability is specific, honest, and forward-looking. It notices what actually happened without inflation. It names what didn't work without verdict. It asks what the next attempt will look like. It treats the person as capable of honest self-assessment, rather than needing to be protected from accurate feedback or punished by it. I've been on the receiving end of mentorship that was really the mentor managing their own anxiety about my situation. The advice was frequent, detailed, and almost entirely about making them feel better about what I was going through. It wasn't useless, but it wasn't what I needed. What I needed was someone who could stay calm about my difficulty, not because they didn't care, but because their calm gave me evidence that the situation was survivable. That's the whole role, really. Be the evidence. Not that stress doesn't exist, not that difficulty isn't real, but that capable people encounter both and remain intact. That the experience of pressure doesn't have to produce the outcome of breaking. That the person in front of you, who is currently convinced that what they're feeling means something terrible, can handle this. And you know it. Not because you're being optimistic, but because you've watched humans handle hard things, including yourself. And the evidence is fairly clear. Be the evidence, then get out of the way. You were never looking for a stress-free life. You were looking for a self that stress couldn't touch. That's the real project. Not the elimination of pressure. Pressure is not going anywhere. Not the absence of fear. Fear is information, poorly labeled. But the construction of a person who encounters difficulty and remains essentially themselves, functional, present, capable of the next move. Everything in this book points at the same thing from different angles. The body that stays regulated, the pause that creates choice, the meaning that gets assigned deliberately, the discomfort chosen voluntarily, the systems built in calm, the recovery taken seriously, the immunity built daily in the unremarkable intervals between crises. None of it is dramatic. That's the point. The unbreakable person is not the one who never feels the pressure. It's the one who felt it 10,000 times in small doses and quietly updated their relationship with it each time. Who built something slowly that circumstance keeps testing and keeps failing to destroy. You don't become that person in a crisis. You become that person on an ordinary Tuesday, making the slightly harder choice when nobody is watching and nothing urgent is happening.